literature that develops after 1848 is talking about how the African population is lazy. Before 1848, Governor Light, in all his pronouncements, are talking about the progress in the African villages. And after 1848, Governor Barclay and all the other succeeding governors are talking about how the African population have gone into the pale beyond civilization and they're now lazy. Right? So, I mean, I give you that anecdote. So I continued the conversation with these Indian youth. And I said, well, that is an interesting term. I want you to tell me, when you were growing up as a child, what did you see in the African village? And they said, look, what did we see? We saw these African people digging their trenches and their drains with shovel by hand. We saw them planting these lands and said, well, flip over to your parents now, because only a dam divided two villages. Like every dam divide an African and an Indian village in Guyana. What did you see what your parents was doing? Said we were planting rice. I said, what else? Said we were employing drag lines and machinery to dig our trenches. We were using tractors in our rice fields. Right? I said, well, let us fast forward to the future. When you look at the African village today, you said that it's now in bush. Right? Let's talk about what you're doing now, because you have inherited land from your parents. One of them said that he inherited 40 acres from his parents. And I said, so what are you doing for a living? And he said, I am driving a truck. I said, well, you have 40 acres of land and you're driving a truck. Why are you driving a truck? He said, because in the conditions of the economy, it can no longer pay for a person to make a living from 40 acres of land. That you can no longer make a living from 40 acres of land as an individual. And I said, well, how much land you think each African person have in the villages? And he said, well, they have a dam bed here and a little piece there. And I said to him, well, if you cannot make a living from 40 acres of land, do you think an average African person in a village can make a living from a quarter acre of land? And you know what the Indian youth turned and told me? He said, it is the first time that anybody have had a conversation with me without talking about race that allows me to see race. He said from that conversation, from that interview, he was able to see how this disparity developed. Now, that is what I want to do. The importance is that we have to recapture that history. But it's not mobilized, it's mobilizable. But it has remained immobilized over the past 150 years. I mean, succeeding governments have done nothing to mobilize the capacity of the villages. They have mobilized the capacity of the villages for political action, not for action in their own defense. The answer, that was the difference between Walter and these guys, is that Walter wanted to mobilize the villages for economic action in their own defense. He did not want to mobilize the villages for political action, to use them in order to gain political power. That's the difference. Guyana is a political place where people the political parties use the masses to create the space of political power, right? But they don't give back anything to the villages and to the populations, either East Indians or Africans. Because we can talk about the condition of the African villages. And we can also talk about the condition of the Indian villages. Because there is, in a lot of these villages, there are no real big differences between the bad conditions of the Indian villages and the bad conditions of the African villages. The conditions in these two types of villages are equally stark. You know, let's look at Port Moran, where Dr. Jagan came from. You know, it's a paradox. that he came from that village, right? And I mean, just go among the people. I mean, as an activist, I have lived in cane cutters' houses in Port Morant. And I've seen cane cutters operate like the African workers in the 1850s, where cane cutters, where the wives of cane cutters were sending their children to the shop to buy a quarter pint of cooking oil, a flag of garlic, one onion, in order to cook one meal. This is what the African population, who did not have money in the 1850s because they could not gain enough employment, right, was doing. And the Portuguese shops in the 1850s refused to sell them provisions in small quantities, which was one of the reasons for the riots against the Portuguese in the 1850s. And this is happening now in the sugar communities. So if we look deeply, and we need to do this research, a lot of research is not being done. We need to look at the deeper meanings of life in these two types of villages, because there are similarities in relationship to their conditions. Sometimes my dissertation looks at the African condition, and I was because of what happened in the 19th century, right? But the African condition, the conditions of some of the African villages, I know that I'm going out on a limb here, right, is no different than the conditions in a lot of the East Indian villages. And we have to be able to do this work. And that's the challenge to young students. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. I'm saying that these are questions that we have to explore. And I'm willing to explore these questions, right? Because, look, my work is not political. My work is social. It's sociological. It is, for me, I see it as a resource to inform policy, to inform people who want to make change. And that's the point I'm making. I make the point that if you want to make change, you have to go back to history. And you have to make change based on an understanding of history.